The push and pull of leadership. Leadership involves both pulling and pushing. Management guru Drucker once famously said that the purpose of marketing is to make selling unnecessary. What did he mean? There are two ways to sell a product: pushing it onto customers or pulling them towards it. Drucker believed that if you pull customers effectively, you won't need to push the product onto them. Similarly, skilled leaders use pulling tactics to make pushing tactics unnecessary. Speaking of which, let me tell you a story about Cyrus the Great, the founder of the Persian Empire. When Cyrus was still a young boy, his father began to train him in leadership. His father asked, "What is the best way to make others obey you?" Cyrus replied, "Father, I think the best way is to reward those who obey and punish those who refuse." His father said, "That may work, but what about in dangerous situations? What if you're not there to supervise? Rewards and punishments may not be effective then. There is a better way: take care of those you lead, even better than they take care of themselves. Put their needs before your own." Cyrus's two ways of leading are pushing tactics, while his father's method is a pulling tactic. Power, of course, pushing and pulling tactics are not limited to the examples given above. What are some other examples of pushing and pulling tactics? To answer that, we need to explore the concept of power. Let me give you 3 examples and think about which one represents power. The first example is a robber holding a knife to your throat and demanding your wallet. The second example is your boss asking you to work overtime when you had planned to go home. The third example is your colleague telling you about a great movie and convincing you to watch it with them. Which of these 3 examples represents power? The answer may surprise you. All 3 represent power. Power is a core concept in social science. Scholars have various definitions of power, but they can generally be summarized as follows. Power is the ability to make others listen to you. If someone can make others listen to them, they have power. The robber, the boss, and the colleague all made someone listen to them, so they all represent power, albeit in different ways. You may now be thinking about which of these ways are pushing tactics and which are pulling tactics. 5 types of power. What are these ways? In management and social psychology textbooks, there are 5 types of power that can make others listen to you. Before we discuss which are pushing and which are pulling tactics, let's explore what these 5 types of power are. They may sound complicated, but they are actually quite simple. The first type is reward power. Reward power is the power of incentives. The second type is coercive power. Coercive power is the power of punishment. These are what we commonly refer to as the carrot and the stick, and they are the 2 ways of making others obey that Cyrus's father mentioned earlier. Both are pushing tactics. The third type is legitimate power. Legitimate power is the power granted by an organization or society. For example, a position is the most common form of legitimate power. A boss can make an employee work overtime because the boss has legitimate power granted by the organization. Legitimate power can also come from other sources, such as cultural values. For example, when an elderly person asks for a seat on a bus, people usually give up their seats because of a cultural value, not because of a position. The fourth type is expert power. Expert power comes from professional knowledge or skills. For example, when a doctor prescribes medication, people usually follow the prescription because the doctor has expert power. The first 4 types of power, reward power, coercive power, legitimate power, and expert power, are relatively easy to understand. The 5th type is referent power, which may sound a bit more obscure. Referent power is the power of being a role model or a reference point. For example, a celebrity can influence their fans because they have referent power. You may not worship a particular celebrity, but you admire and identify with them, so they have referent power over you. Cyrus's father's method of making others obey is referent power. In international relations, there is a concept called soft power, which refers to referent power. So, we have discussed the 5 types of power, and we can see that reward power, coercive power, and legitimate power are pushing tactics, while expert power and referent power are pulling tactics. Almost all textbooks on the subject discuss these 5 types of power. The 6th power. We have discussed the 5 powers earlier, but have you ever thought about the 6th power? The power of persuasion, also known as informational power, is the 6th power. When a colleague convinces you to watch a movie, they are using the power of persuasion. The process of introducing the 6th power is interesting. The 5 powers we discussed earlier were proposed by 2 social psychologists named French and Raven in 1959. When they proposed the 5 powers, French was the teacher and Raven was the student. Raven suggested that there was a 6th power, the power of persuasion, but French disagreed. French believed that the concept of power implied making someone do something they did not want to do, so persuasion should not be included. Raven, on the other hand, believed that the definition of power was making someone listen to you, so the power of persuasion should be included. At the time, Raven conceded to his teacher's opinion, not because he was persuaded or because of reward or coercive power, but mainly because of French's legitimate power as a teacher. Of course, there may have been some expert and referent power involved as well. However, after French passed away, Raven published an article separately and added the power of persuasion to the list. I agree with Raven's opinion that power is making someone listen to you. Persuasion is a form of power and a very important one at that. Persuasion is a higher level of power than the other powers because when someone listens to you, they do not feel like they are listening to you, but rather themselves. This is a very important form of power. This power was not discovered by Raven alone. There is a famous philosopher named Russell who said that changing someone's perspective is also an important form of power. Leadership mainly uses the power of attraction, or pulling power. We have now discussed the 6 powers: reward power, coercive power, legitimate power, expert power, referent power, and the power of persuasion. These 6 powers can be further divided into 2 categories: positional power, which includes reward power, coercive power, and legitimate power, and personal power, which includes expert power, referent power, and the power of persuasion. Leadership mainly uses the power of attraction, or pulling power, rather than pushing power. The main difference between power and leadership is that power achieves a one-sided goal, while leadership achieves a mutual goal. A robber with a knife achieves only his own goal, so he is only exercising power. If a superior asks you to work overtime, is it power or leadership? It depends on who benefits from the overtime. If only the superior benefits, it is power. If both parties benefit, it may be leadership. Therefore, leadership is not about setting a one-sided goal and pushing it onto others. Leadership is about setting a common goal, making others believe in it, attracting them to the goal, and making them willingly invest in it. In this process, personal power, such as expert power, referent power, and the power of persuasion, is more effective than positional power, such as reward power, coercive power, and legitimate power. Let's think about the example of Gandhi. In leading India to independence, he did not use much pushing power, but rather pulling power. His pulling power mainly came from referent power and the power of persuasion. He set himself as an example, made himself a reference point, and persuaded everyone to adopt nonviolent non-cooperation as a voluntary action. In summary, the key point of this lecture is that leadership experts are good at using pulling power and making pushing power redundant.